Well, good morning, Edgewood, and good morning, Gallup. How many of you really enjoy fire drills? You know, that loud blaring noise going off, and then you got to run outside or, walk calmly outside in single file, and then gather in a certain spot. How do we respond to those alarms when they go off? I'll tell you, one time when I was in college, a year when I was an RA there, it was an evening, it was late actually, and I had said goodnight to Martha. She had gone off to her dorm room. I went to mine. And then, of course, it's 10 o'clock. And then you start the term paper that's due the next morning. And so we were, half of us in the dorm, I'm sure, were doing that. The other half had gone to sleep or were playing video games or something silly like that. And about 11 o'clock, or maybe it was even later, it's not real clear in my memory, the alarm starts going off. The fire alarm starts going off. As the RA, kind of responsible for making sure nobody dies. So start getting everybody out, start getting them down the stairs and outside to the place where we can gather. And, some people came willingly. Some people were out there before I even realized what was going on, sort of thing. They were ready to go, as was appropriate when the fire alarm goes off. Some people did not come willingly. They were either in the middle of a paragraph and had to finish that thought before they could, be bothered to go outside because of some fire possibly wreaking havoc through the building, or they were asleep. And one guy, he actually had night terrors. That was fun, but we got him outside. And finally made it outside, and we're going through the roster, making sure we have everybody, and realized there was this one guy who sleeps really hard. He uses earplugs, and he had music going that we had missed. We had forgotten, and so he was left behind. Poor guy. Luckily, it was just a drill, so nobody was hurt. But how do we respond to alarms? And I ask that because in the context of our message today, I believe that God gives us alarms in our life anytime that there's a situation that might compromise our faith. And so how do we respond to those alarms that God gives us? And I'll tell you, I feel like growing up, there is kind of this mantra that in our culture today, we needed to be tolerant. And what that typically meant was if you have to be tolerant, you have to not necessarily agree with everybody, but you have to go along with that. And if you don't agree, then you're intolerant, but just don't make a mess with everybody else's life, that sort of thing. And I feel like I may be wrong. Maybe it's just because I'm a little more aware of the world and stuff now, but it seems to be shifting rapidly away from just tolerance more towards agree with me or you're evil sort of thing. And I believe that that's going to put more and more of us in situations over time that will probably threaten to compromise our faith. And it's those times when God sends the alarm through our conscience, our heart, our mind, blaring. And how do we respond to those alarms? I mean, there's a lot of options. We can go along willingly, single file, orderly manner, etc. We can drag our feet because we feel like God is just making up all these rules. Oh man, why do you have to make life so difficult to follow you, God? We can stay in bed with the music on, earplugs in, get left behind. How do we respond when God sends those alarms into our life, through our heart, through our conscience? In today's story, we're going to be looking in the book of Daniel, chapter 1, which if you're using the Bibles in the seat back in front of you, that's page 737, just like that Boeing Max jet. So if you want to use those, you can turn there and follow along. But we're going to be looking at 4 guys who encountered a potential situation for compromising their faith. And they heard the alarm and they responded to it. And we'll see what they did with that. But first, kind of get into the background of the story. Daniel chapter 1, we're going to read the first 4 verses. It says this is talking about the southern kingdom of Judah. It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and laid siege to it. The Lord handed Jehoiakim, king of Judah, over to him, along with some of the vessels from the house of God. Nebuchadnezzar carried them to the land of Babylon, to the house of his God, and put the vessels in the treasury of his God. So just a way to say, my God's better than your God because we conquered you, sort of thing. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his court officials, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and from the nobility, young men without any physical defect, good-looking, suitable for instruction in all wisdom, knowledgeable, perceptive, and capable of serving in the king's palace, and to teach them the Chaldean language and literature. Chaldean, that's Babylonian. And so there's a situation where it's about 606, 605 BC where Nebuchadnezzar, he's actually the crown prince of Babylon when his campaign starts, and he goes down to Egypt and he conquers Pharaoh Necho at the time, who was just another empire that was against him. And while he's on this campaign, he finds out that his dad has died and now he is king. And so he finishes that campaign and starts heading back to Babylon. And on his way, he decides to make a pit stop in Jerusalem, conquer the little guys, then take some of their stuff and bring it home. And along with that, he brings some of the young men, the nobility, who were there to become court officials in his palace. Now, this was actually prophesied generations before in Isaiah chapter 39. In verse 7, this is where Isaiah is speaking to King Hezekiah at the time, who Hezekiah has just got finished showing off all the wonders and gold and stuff in the temple to the visiting Babylonians. And this is what Isaiah says to him: some of your descendants who come from you will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. And so we've got all these young men, probably 14, 15, something like that. And they are taken out of their homes. They're taken away from their families and make a 900-mile journey away from Jerusalem to Babylon. And now, a good crack team in the army at that time could probably do 30 miles a day, puts you at about a month for traveling. Later in the Bible, we hear about Ezra, and they're traveling actually from Babylon back to Jerusalem, but they've got families, they've got children, they've got elderly, things like that, and it takes them 4 months to make the journey. So my best guess, this is my opinion, I bet that these guys were probably in the range of 2 to 3 months on the road making that 900-mile trek. And so there they are on their way, going to Babylon to become court officials. And then in Daniel in verse 5, it says, the king assigned them daily provisions from the royal food and from the wine that he drank. They were to be trained for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to serve in the king's court. So, new home, new education. They're learning the language of the Chaldeans. They're reading the books of the Babylonians, all about the sorcery and exorcism type stuff, along with just historical type documents, figuring out how to become good court officials for King Nebuchadnezzar. They're probably given new clothes, especially after a journey of that distance. They're given a new diet. And in fact, in the verses just after that, we find that they're given new names. The four main characters of our story are 4 young Jewish guys named Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And they are given new names. All of their names in Hebrew refer to God, the God of Israel, the God Yahweh, and are honoring to him. But they're given new names. Daniel's given Belshazzar. Mishael is given Mishael is given Meshach. Hananiah is given Shadrach, and Azariah is given Abednego. And all of their new Babylonian names are about honoring the Babylonian gods, the false gods, the idols that the Babylonians worship. So, new name, new food, new education, new country, separated from their families and everything. And it's interesting to me, and probably I mentioned the eunuch thing, probably castrated. All these things to make them good Babylonians, to make them good court officials for Nebuchadnezzar. But Daniel, it says in verse 8, it says, Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Now that's interesting to me. Why is he drawing the line there? Why is he saying, after all this other stuff that's happened to them, of being pulled away? I mean, they could have drawn the line at being pulled away from their home and could run back to Jerusalem. They could have drawn the line at, no, you can't call me that. That's an evil name. It points to an evil God and honors him. That's not even real, a false God. Why are they drawing the line at food? And so a couple possibilities. The food that they were given from the king's provisions, there's a couple possibilities, either, and probably both. It didn't align with the Jewish dietary laws. It wasn't kosher, basically. It doesn't necessarily mean it was pork. It could have been bread even that just wasn't handled correctly according to the Jewish laws. But also likely, is that this food had been presented before the false gods, before the idols that the Babylonians worshipped, on its way to the king's table before it got sent to them to eat. And if you think about the situation that Daniel and his friends are in, God has sent the Babylonians to wreck Judah because they were disobeying him, because they were worshiping idols. One of the primary reasons is because they weren't worshiping God, they were worshiping idols instead. That's the situation that Daniel and his friends find themselves in. And so I think that's probably, in my opinion, the main reason that maybe they stood up and decided to draw the line in the sand. See, Daniel heard the alarm. He heard the alarm saying, if you eat this food, it seems like such a little thing, but if you eat this food, drink this wine, then you're going to be honoring the idols, the false gods, that your people just got in so much trouble for honoring. So are you going to respond to the alarm? Or are you going to ignore it? And so we see that Daniel determined in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's food. So the second half of that verse says he asked permission from the chief official not to defile himself. Now that's weird. He's made this decision. He's drawn the line in the sand and he's like, hey, do you mind if I don't defile myself? He's asking permission. That seems strange to me. I hope it seems strange to you too. And you got to wonder, why is he bothering? I mean, what could they have done? They could have decided, you know what, we're just not going to eat. We're just going to starve to death. And we won't dishonor God, but we're just going to starve to death. He could have said, you know what, we're going to get angry. We're going to complain. We're going to whine all the time until you give us the food we want. Angry at these people who have called us away, taken us captive out of our homes, away from our families, away from the inheritance we had as nobles. Could have got angry at God. This God who has put them in this situation, who has sent the Babylonians to bring them into this situation. I mean, lots of potential ideas. Instead, they determined his heart, and then they asked permission. And I think the primary reason that they asked permission not to defile themselves, as it says, has to do with submitting to authorities. You see, in the New Testament, I think we have some really prime examples, some real direct instructions on how to respond to authorities. Romans 13, I'm going to read here, is one really good example. It says, everyone must submit to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those that exist are instituted by God. So then, the one who resists the authority is opposing God's command, and those who oppose it will bring judgment on themselves. And so, you got to remember, this was written at a time when the Roman Empire was anti-Christian, and Christians were being persecuted and stuff, and yet Paul still felt that it was right to instruct people to submit to the governing authorities. Interesting. I don't know exactly what to do with that. And you got to think, especially in Daniel's situation, or maybe in your situation, what if they say no? What am I supposed to do then? Well, let's find out. In verse 10, Daniel has come to the chief official and he's asked permission. And this is a guy who God has granted Daniel favor with him. It says that he shows compassion towards Daniel. But yet he said to Daniel, my lord the king assigned your food and drink. So the king says, you got to eat this. I'm afraid of what would happen if he saw your faces looking thinner than those of the other young men your age. You would endanger my life with the king. So it's a real situation. This is real life. I mean, he has a responsibility to make sure that all these young guys that they just captured, that they brought back from Jerusalem, and probably some other places along the way, look good, look healthy, aren't all scrawny and gaunt from that 900-mile, 2 to 3 month trek, okay? They need to be fat. They need to look good for the king. And so he just shares, hey, this is the reality. I'd love to help you out, but I can't because I'm afraid of what would happen. The king would execute me if he saw you guys looking awful and then found out it was because of what I was feeding you, that I was disobeying him in the process. So in a sense, Daniel got told no. But we find the story goes on, and it ends up that Daniel and his friends actually go to the guard who is directly over them and cut a deal with him, or propose a plan to him, I should say. And I got to wonder if in their conversation with the chief official, if there wasn't anything like a wink and a nod of saying, I can't do this, I can't approve of this, ask that guy or something like that. But in verse 12, Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah propose, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Yay! Our favorite foods in the whole wide world, right? This is where that Daniel Plan thing kind of comes from. I don't know if it actually applies because the whole point of that Daniel Plan book nowadays is about losing weight. They were trying to gain weight. But that's neither here nor there. So they proposed a plan to be tested for 10 days. And then they were to be compared to all the other people, all the other young men who were eating what the king had assigned. And if they look better, great. If they look worse, okay, then we'll figure it out from there. But they proposed a plan. It's interesting to me. Daniel was very strategic. I mean, you think about, well, like what Brandon was talking about last week in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 7, it talks about seek the welfare of the city. And seek the good for the people around you. Be a good influence and help this sphere of people that are around you. If Daniel had argued with the chief official, if they had just gone on a hunger strike or something like that, and the chief official had lost his head, would that have been for his benefit? Nope. That would have been junky. That would have stunk. But instead, Daniel and his friends were strategic, and they came up with a plan. And they proposed a plan, still submitting to authorities. Just try us out. Let's test us for 10 days, see if this would work. And the results came in. At the end of 10 days, they looked better and healthier than all the young men who were eating the king's food. So the guard continued to remove their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. For 3 years. They lived on water and vegetables for 3 years. That's quinoa, that's celery, that's a bunch of bread. I don't know if I could do it. Anyway, but they did that for 3 years. And at the end of the 3 years, they were presented to the king. It says, the king interviewed them, and among all of them, no one was found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they began to serve in the king's court. In every matter of wisdom and understanding that the king consulted them about, he found them 10 times better than all the diviner priests and mediums in his entire kingdom. See, during that time, well, let me ask you this. How many of you have been at work and there's a new hire and it's this college student who just graduated, and it ends up turning out that they're like the best worker in the world. They have all the knowledge that you need to do the job well, and they're such hard workers, show up on time, et cetera, et cetera. That doesn't happen, right? College students typically have a lot to learn before they can become really effective at the jobs that they were hired for. Well, Daniel and his friends, they finish up their college training, go to be interviewed, and they're 10 times better than the guys who have been doing it for 20 to 30 years. You see, they responded to the alarm that God set. They responded appropriately, and God honored that. He gave them knowledge, he gave them wisdom, he gave them understanding. He gave Daniel, it says, the ability to understand dreams and visions. And God honored that to the point that they were 10 times better than anybody else who was trying to do their job. Guys who had been doing it for 20, 30 years. That doesn't happen except by God working in their lives. That's pretty amazing. And they were effective. Think about it. They were effective employees for the evil empire of Babylon. They just were. I mean, this country, this empire that worshipped false gods, worshipped idols, but they worked hard, and they were 10 times more effective. So here's my bottom line, is that God sounds the alarm for our good and for his glory. See, it's so easy to think that when the alarm sounds that it's just going to be a pain, and sometimes it's going to cause trouble. But God does it. He sounds the alarm for our good and for his glory. He wants what's best for us. So how do we own it? What do we do with this? Because I think the first thing that we can do is to develop convictions. You see, if you think about Daniel and his friends, they weren't wandering through life, were presented with this food and were like, I don't like that. I don't think I'm going to eat it. I mean, I probably could, but I don't want to, so I'm not going to. It wasn't anything like that. They had a conviction. They determined in their heart, they drew the line in the sand because they knew that if they ate that food that had been offered to idols, they would have been honoring those false gods. They would have been honoring those idols rather than the God that they wanted to serve, rather than the true God. See, sometimes when we think about our conscience, I think, and this voice inside our head that's telling us right from wrong and stuff, We feel like it has to do with a lot of gray areas. I think the majority of the time, if we are pursuing a relationship with God, if we try to know him more and know his word more, then there's not nearly as much gray area as we think. Now, in one sense, I think Daniel and his friends had it easier than us. They also had it harder than us, and this is what I mean. They had a list of rules and regulations, of do's and do-nots that they could check off, in a sense. That they knew what to do exactly because God had told them what to do exactly in order to honor him. We don't have that anymore, and it's a good thing because we don't have it, because Jesus died on the cross and he fulfilled all of those rules and regulations to where we don't have to check off the box in order to be right with God, because Jesus has made us right with God. And that's so much better, so much harder too, because that means that our relationship with God isn't about just checking off a box, but it's about pursuing him and getting to know him. And it's about loving God and loving people in the way that Jesus loved God and loved people, to the point of dying on the cross for us, for you. That's both easier because it comes out of relationship, and more difficult because God is challenging us to more. God is challenging us to something greater. And so to develop convictions, I think it starts with getting to know God and reading this, knowing this. What God has already said is a really, really good way to get to know him. And reading through Jesus' life, seeing how he interacted with people and growing closer to him through that. I believe God will provide you with some very clear convictions. There are some things in here that are super black and white. Don't murder. Don't commit adultery. There's some things like that. But in the process, I think there's also some areas in our lives that we feel are a little more gray, that God will use principles in here to guide us to the convictions that he has called us to. And I say that, and some of these, God's going to call us maybe to different places. Maybe he calls some of you to be Democrats. Maybe he calls some of you to be Republicans, maybe libertarians, maybe socialists. Who knows? That isn't in here. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about. Maybe he calls some of you to watch certain movies, listen to certain music and shows and stuff. Maybe others, he's given you a conviction not to. My wife and I, we have a conviction that there's certain content in movies that we just won't watch that movie if it's in there, having to do with sexual stuff. Just for my benefit and for the benefit of our relationship, we don't want that in our lives. And sometimes it's really easy. It's really obvious just by the cover of the movie or whatever. We're not going to watch that. Sometimes we watch the trailer and like, cool, that looks like an awesome movie. We're going to go watch it. And then we look it up on imdb.com, look at the parental guide and see what's in there. And like, I guess we won't. But that's a conviction we have. And there's different convictions that God is going to give you in areas like that. So the first thing to do is to develop convictions. Second thing to do is really to respond to those convictions. See, God will sound the alarm if you've developed those convictions. He'll sound the alarm when those situations come up that could compromise your faith, but you still have to respond to it. You still have to act on it. And then the last thing is to be strategic. I love how Daniel and his friends were submissive to the authorities. But they also didn't just go along with things. They were smart. And they came up with a plan that not only benefited them and honored God, but benefited the people around them. You think the king, when he saw 4 guys come out of this training group, this college program, who were 10 times better than everybody else Nebuchadnezzar had working for him, that chief official didn't get a pat on the back or promotion or whatever? I mean, that was for Daniel and his friends' good, God's glory, and also the benefit of the people around them. So be strategic. And here's one, I think, specific application I would like to pull from this for being strategic. See, our lives are complicated. Sometimes not as much as we think, but sometimes even if we think they're complicated, that's what it is for us. And so to figure out how to be strategic in certain situations, or even how to develop certain convictions, I think we sometimes are too alone. And we don't know what to do with it. That's just the reality. But God has called us into community. God has called us to do this with other people. So real specific application, I want you guys to get into small groups. If you're not in a small group, get in a small group to where you can be walking along, you can be doing life with people who are wanting to honor God just as much as you are. Maybe more than you do. and they will challenge you to grow, and they will help you develop convictions. And when those situations come up that are questionable, that you're not sure exactly what to do with it, but you feel like you hear the alarm bell going off, what do I do with it? And they can help you work through that. They can help you come up with a plan that is strategic, who to approach, how to say what you need to say, so that you can you can seek the welfare of those around you. You can seek the good for the city that you're in, the workplace you're in, the family that you're in. Let's be strategic. So what would it look like if we responded to the alarms that God set off in our minds? Well, you'd live purposefully. You're not just wandering through life, wondering what's right, what's wrong, but you would live purposely if you've developed those convictions. And then you think about the other guys in this group of young men that were with Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah. What happened to them? The guys who decided to eat the food, who decided to drink the wine that had probably been sacrificed to idols or offered to idols. We don't know. That's the reality. We don't know what happened to them. It's not that nobody cares, but God cared. Their parents, their family probably cared. But we have no idea what happened to them because they kind of just fade into the background because they didn't honor God. That's the reality of it. And if you think about it too, our text talks about how Daniel determined in his heart not to defile himself. Now, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are part of his group, but I wonder, what if Daniel hadn't determined anything in his heart and had gone along with stuff? Would we know about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Or would they have faded into the background as well? See, here's the possibility. You may be able, as you're developing convictions and you're responding to the alarms that God sends, you may be able to bring others along with you. Maybe God is calling you to lead a small group at some point. You may be able to bring others along with you so that potentially, I don't know how God will work this out in your life or in my life, but potentially that all of you could be 10 times better, 10 times more effective in your workplace, in your families, in living out your faith, so that when people around you are looking at you and seeing how you live and they say, he talks about his God, and I want what they have. To be 10 times more effective, that just boggles the mind. That blows me away. How will you respond when God sounds the alarm in your life? Let's pray. God, I thank you for your Son. I thank you for the opportunity that we have to live a life for you that isn't dependent on a checklist of rules and regulations of do's and don'ts, but that you've called us into something greater to honor you and to love you. God, I pray that you would give us the wisdom and the knowledge to develop these convictions and to respond to them, the courage that will require, Lord. I pray all this in Jesus' name.